Well, hello there, everyone. Today, we're going to be giving a look, or having a look rather, and beginning chapter 8, which, as you can see here, let me get my screen the right way. There we go. That's what we want. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at in chapter 8 is a string of reform movements that are prevalent in the United States in the mid 19th century from the 1830s, 1840s, and moving into the 1850s. And this is consistent with and coincides with the whole Jacksonian democracy theme that we were looking at last time, in this period of democracy expanding and the country changing and the country becoming a little bit more open. Now, certainly not, incredibly democratic and totally democratic by our standards today, but perhaps becoming a bit more inclusive and living up to its ideals a little bit more. Some of that has to do with a lot of the things we talked about last time with Andrew Jackson and the inclusion of new voters and all that sort of stuff. But some of it also has to do with these reform movements that were taking place. There were a lot of individuals, there were a lot of groups of people that were taking a really hard look at American society and finding places where the system wasn't working well for people, or places where there were inconsistencies or things that they felt were just wrong or immoral or not Christian. And so they took it upon themselves to try to change some of those things. So we're going to see lots of changes in this period, a lot of movements that were successful and some that were not successful at all, some that were trying to make life better and the country more democratic, and some that when we look at them by today's standards seem kind of far-fetched and kind of crazy and perhaps not very democratic at all. But one of the first thing we're going to talk about is the movement that in many ways inspires and leads to a lot of these reform movements, which actually has its basis in religion. So before we get to some of these specific reform movements, we're first going to talk about a major cultural movement, a religious movement that was sweeping the United States in the 1830s and 40s that is going to become the spark for a lot of the reform movements that are to come after it. So let's take a look at this reform movement, this religious movement rather, which, if you haven't guessed, is going to be another Great Awakening. You may recall from earlier chapters in the colonial era, we saw a religious revival of religious movement sweep across the American colonies called the Great Awakening. And I mentioned then that that is sometimes called the First Great Awakening because there would be a second one that happens in the mid 19th century. And here we are with that one, the Second Great Awakening, which occurs really throughout the 1830s and 40s. Just like the First Great Awakening, it's not a one-time or even a one-year event. It is something that starts to develop and gradually moves across the United States, affecting really all parts of it. Now, the Second Great Awakening, just like the first one, it's going to be a religious revival, another religious reawakening, where religion and religious teachings and faith and religious conversion is going to be emphasized in a way that it hadn't been in previous decades. And we're going to see this massive push to re-energize people's faith and to re-energize people's commitment and devotion to religion and to their faith. And in that way, it is very, very similar. It has a lot of similar characteristics and qualities of the First Great Awakening, but it also has some unique things about it. For one, this religious revival is actually a lot bigger than the first one. This one is even larger. It affects even more people. It covers even more area. And therefore, you could argue has a really, there's those bells, quite a significant impact on the United States as a whole. Before we look at some of the specifics about the Second Great Awakening, what made it unique and different, let's talk a little bit about some of its causes. And this is another place in which it is quite similar really to the First Great Awakening. If you remember, the First Great Awakening was largely caused out of essentially a concern that people were falling away from religion, that people were not as religiously devout as they once were. And the same thing happens here. Denominations of the colonial days, the Anglican Church, for example, which was the Church of England in America, that had been on the decline since the Revolution. Really, it had lost a lot of its appeal. It had lost a lot of its membership because of its association with England. That was part of the reason for that. Also, as the country moved westward, as it expanded, as people moved out into the frontier, into the woodsy areas, into the less civilized areas, there weren't existing churches there. It was more likely that people were going to live out without people close to them, without churches close to them. And so as the country spreads out, religion became a little bit harder to come by, or at least people being as devout and as strict as they maybe once had been. So just as in the First Great Awakening, there was concern that the country was moving too far away from its religious roots, that it was becoming too secular. And also, just like the First Great Awakening was caused partially by the Enlightenment, this, concern that people were getting ideas that were contrary to religion. You have some of that here as well. I'm not going to go into some of the specifics about some of those ideas, but there were some new ideas or new interest in some ideas that challenged a lot of religious ideas, that challenged, for example, the divinity of Christ, that challenged some of the miraculous things that are described in the Bible, things like that. And so some people were concerned about that, saw that as heretical. It seemed like atheism. They were really concerned about that. So there's a concern that people have just fallen too far away. We're not as religious as we once were. It's damaging our society, and we kind of have to get back to our roots. And so we see this religious revival start to take place. And it really has two areas to it, two centers to it, which is interesting. A lot of the Second Great Awakening is taking place in New England, and is taking place and can really be centered in New England colleges and universities. So there is kind of the intellectual side of this. But another big area where the Second Great Awakening is taking place, the real center of this, is the frontier. It's rural America, those places I was just talking about, where a lot of people were moving to, where they were removed from religion. That then becomes the epicenter of the Great Awakening. That becomes the place where these religious revivals are really taking shape and where people are being greatly affected. It is out there on the frontier in rural America, where people were spread out, where people were isolated, where people were cut off. And you can see how those kinds of factors would lend themselves to a religious revival happening, because people would see this as a means of having community, as a means of having connection with other people and with other groups. It's kind of a cure, I guess you could say, or maybe that's not the right word, but a remedy perhaps for the sometimes isolating nature of frontier life. And so that becomes one of the areas in which we really see this happening. So a lot of the Great Awakening preaching and services is not actually happening in physical churches, which is a lot like the First Great Awakening. It's out in these big open air meetings, kind of like this picture that's sort of behind me. People coming from miles around to these big open area spaces, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, coming to listen to these itinerant traveling preachers that would come to preach messages and try to convert as many people as they could, because this is ultimately an evangelical revival. And the principle of evangelicalism is you're trying to spread that message to others and trying to convert others and bring in new believers and new members to the fold. So as well as an emphasis on evangelizing, an emphasis on bringing this message to as many people as possible, let's talk a little bit else about some of the other messages or some of the common themes or common threads, common ideas amongst Great Awakening messages. One of the big themes of a lot of Second Great Awakening messages is the concept, and this is similar to the first, that salvation is available to everyone, that it is not just a select few, but salvation is open to anyone who repents. There is a big emphasis in not just salvation being open to everyone, but anybody can be saved. Anyone can repent. If you just repent and acknowledge your sin and ask for forgiveness, then you can have it and that you can be saved. That no one was beyond being saved. That class did not have anything to do with that. The economic status didn't have anything to do with that. Race had nothing to do with that. Gender had nothing to do with that. That everything and everyone could be saved. And that's not just a comment on, men and women and that sort of thing, but that there's no problem, there's no sin that you could commit that would forever, mean the end of you couldn't be saved, the end of your soul, that anyone's soul could be saved, that even the worst person, that even someone that had done terrible things could still be saved, that even someone that seemed beyond hope, whether they had committed terrible crimes, whether they were an alcoholic, whatever it was, that even that person could be redeemed, that nothing and no one was beyond redemption. And so that is there is a message of equality in there that we saw like in the First Great Awakening, but this emphasis on redemption is going to have a big impact on the reform movements that are to come as well. So there is an emphasis on everybody can be involved, everybody can participate, nobody is better than anybody else in the eyes of God, but also this emphasis on redemption. And a lot of people found that very, very empowering, particularly people on the frontier that were isolated, and also more marginalized groups found that empowering. We're going to talk a lot about the role of women in all of this. Women found this message particularly empowering, and women could participate as equals in this movement in a time when they couldn't vote, in a time when they couldn't participate as equals in other parts of society. So let's talk about some of the effects of this, some of the results of the Second Great Awakening. Obviously, one big one is going to be more religion and more religious conversion and more churches and more church membership. That is going to be huge that we will see in this period. Church membership is going to more than double in this time, particularly certain denominations like Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, a lot of those similar to in the First Great Awakening that were not, or at least less focused on dogma and less focused on strict rules, that were more autonomous, not controlled by larger organizations, Baptists, for example, that did not have like hierarchy and those kinds of things. And also those that emphasized evangelism. Those would have very much appealed to people on the frontier, and churches become far more prevalent even in rural areas. Churches really become kind of the civilizing institution for a lot of rural areas, places where people may not have lived in towns. The church became the one place where you interacted with others outside of your own family. The church became the one place where maybe, even some kind of discipline and justice was even administered. So it really becomes an interesting part of frontier life and an interesting part of the fabric of America of the time. And this also, the Second Great Awakening really emphasizes a very democratic faith in which the congregation is involved, in which the congregation is included. As I was saying a moment ago, part of the message of the Second Great Awakening was that all could be included. So there's more of a role for the average person, for the lay person, people that were not clergy, by the way, is what that means. More of a role for women, that women could be included in that as well. So it's a much more democratic faith and a much more active faith. This is a type of message, a type of theme, and these are denominations that really valued activism, that valued doing, that it was not enough to just sit in church on Sunday, that you had to go out and do. That is part of evangelism in a way. And so you had to take action. You had to act upon your faith, that it was not faith alone that made a person worthy, but good works, that you had to do things. You had to go out into the world and bring the message to others and fix the problems that you saw and confront sin in society and confront bad things in society, which also contributes to some of these overall results. So as well as, huge numbers as far as church membership and all those sorts of things, and whole new denominations coming out of this. The Mormons, for example, become a completely new denomination that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. I'm not going to talk about it here, but make sure you read about the Mormons and their some of their characteristics and how they represent some parts of the Second Great Awakening. But another big result of the Second Great Awakening, it is the Second Great Awakening that largely sparks a lot of these reform movements that we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the chapter. As I was saying a moment ago, the Second Great Awakening really emphasizes action. It emphasizes an active faith, that it wasn't enough to just pray and read the Bible and go to church on Sunday. You had to go out into the world and do things. And this religious conversion and this religious experience and this religious conviction that really inspires a lot of people to start doing that, to start going after some of the problems that they saw. And so many of these reform movements that we're going to talk about over the next couple of days, whether it was people trying to clean up the cities, people that were trying to end child labor, people that were trying to improve the conditions in prisons, people that were trying to attack slavery, many of them, one of the things you're going to notice, a common thread, is the emphasis on religion. So many of these people base their beliefs of why what they were seeing was wrong and why it needed to be corrected. It was because they saw it as being a sin. They saw it as being contrary to their religious beliefs. And so many of these people, whether they were abolitionists or women's rights activists or labor activists, even temperance advocates, which we'll talk about who thought that is in a little while, these are people that mostly, not always, but a lot of the time did these things out of deep religious conviction, that went after these problems and crusaded for these changes because they believed that God had commanded them to do so, that this was part of their duty as Christians, to do God's work, to bring about God's kingdom on earth, and that they were convicted and called to do these things. And so it wasn't just about ending slavery. It was about ending slavery because it was a sin. It was harmful, that it was, an abomination in the eyes of God, and therefore it must go. So it's not just about the politics of things. It becomes about the morality, and all of that comes from the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening becomes the spark, the catalyst that gets a lot of these reform movements going, that gets people started, and it inspires and motivates people to actually bring some of these reform movements to life. So we're going to be looking at many of these reform movements, some of which you're just going to read about. We're going to start with what actually is, in some cases, kind of the more extreme example of some of these reform movements. Most of these reformers are people that are going to be trying to work within the system, to change the law, to change the situation, bring about new laws to fix this or stop that or whatever. But there were also those that instead of changing the law, or changing society, actually tried to break away from it, that for whatever reason felt that society either couldn't be changed or wouldn't be changed, and instead wanted to break away from society altogether and form societies that they thought would better live up to their standards. And so here we're going to see in the 19th century, in this portion of the 19th century, hundreds of social utopias or utopian communities spring up. Now, you may recognize the word utopia. The word utopia, you're talking about like perfection. A utopian society is a perfect society in which there are no problems, in which maybe that means no poverty, maybe that means no crime, maybe that means no internal, bickering, maybe that means no rich and poor, those sorts of things. But social utopias, we start to see hundreds of these communities, some of them more successful than others, some of them more significant than others, some of them completely bizarre, some of the strangest stuff you ever heard, and some of them which actually do pretty well. But these social utopias start popping up. Really and truly, it's not an entirely new idea. Really, this idea of perfection to create this ideal situation is really as old as America itself. If you think about the first Puritans, the whole city on a hill idea, that was really a utopia they were trying to create. So we also know that, historically these things rarely work out. And this was also something that was taking hold in a lot of European countries. And in some European countries, a lot of these movements were more successful than they ever were here. So there's more than 100 that come up in the 19th century. Again, some of them are more successful than others. Some of the common things among them, they're all very different. And again, some of them have some really, really strange characteristics to them. But oftentimes they emphasize communal property, for example, or in other words, nobody owning private or owning property individually, but having like property that we all own, that we're all kind of working together as a community to make sure that the land is farmed, to grow the crops that we need, to do the things we need to do, that we're all kind of working together in this community, but it's not like my land or your land or all those kind of things. Communal living, things like that. Some of these are religious in nature. Some of them are not. There are others that are secular in nature. Some of these are inspired, like I said, by religious ideas. Some of them are not. Some Some of them are inspired by or actually the results of things like industrialization. There were some that saw industrialization as harmful, that it was creating poverty, that it was turning people into like robots. And so this was a way to break away from that and have this more idealistic communal place where people, you know, take care of each other and that sort of a thing. So they do, you know, tend to kind of start out strong and then run out of steam. These are just a couple examples of some of the more perhaps familiar ones that occurred in the United States. The Shaker community, for example. The Shaker community does actually is still around. There are not very many Shakers. I think there may even be like less than 10. It may be smaller than that. The Shakers believed in a lot of order and cleanliness and everything having a place. Their greatest influence, even though the community itself is very, very minimal. There's a style of furniture today that is Shaker furniture that is all about clean lines and there's no metal in it and stuff like that. Some of you may have heard of the name Oneida. It is now a brand name of silverware. You can go like into the store and buy Oneida silverware because they were known for their silver work, but they were also one of the real weird ones that had some real strange kind of ideas. And if it reminds you, if you know anything about 20th century, you know, hippie communities and stuff like that, there are some similarities there. It's not quite the same thing, but there's kind of some similar concepts of communal living and, you know, equality and stuff like that in there as well. The Brook Farm Association is one. That's what's depicted down here. The one that's up here above me, this is actually a European utopia, but you can see the whole, and this is like a concept. I never actually got this far, with the whole thing being walled off and you've got the, you know, communal spaces and all that kind of stuff. The idea being that they would inspire others to change. In the end, none of them really have that much of an influence on the outside world, except for the Shakers and their furniture and a few other things like that. Most of them run out of steam within a few years, lose members or fail to convert other members beyond their original people. Some of them are celibate. The Shakers, I think that's true of the Shakers. That may be somebody else I'm thinking of, but they're celibate and don't believe in converts. So eventually they start running out of people. So many of these don't have a huge effect on things in the long term, but they are a very interesting example of kind of an extreme way that some people chose to try to bring about more equality in society, perfection in society, and bring about their own vision. Now let's move on to looking at some of the more tangible ways that we will see some changes made. And many of these things we'll still see these kinds of reforms holding true to today. And that is reforms in education and to the prison system. And here's where, particularly when it comes to prison reform, we will really see the influence of the Second Great Awakening there. When it comes to prison reform and also reform for the mentally ill, the main person we want to talk about there is a lady named Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was a leading crusader in prison reform and reform for the care of the mentally ill. As you probably know, prisons in these days were not very nice places. They were unsanitary, they were crowded. There was absolutely no distinction made between criminals that were really violent and people that, you know, had just committed petty theft. There was no distinction between young criminals. There were no separate facilities for young offenders. You know, they were just thrown in there. Maybe, you know, a 12-year-old kid that stole because they were hungry was thrown in the same place as, you know, a murderer or, you know, whatever. You know, there was just no distinction between any of that. And, you know, certainly no, you know, quality care for prisoners. And it was just sort of a lock people up, throw away the key. And furthermore, in addition to that, there was no distinction made between people that had committed crimes and the mentally ill. A lot of people that were in prisons, or rather, and sometimes they were separate institutions, but again, they were pretty horrible places where people that really their only crime was being mentally ill or perhaps intellectually disabled, just thrown in there with violent criminals and everything else. Dorothea Dix was particularly horrified by that. And you can see how there's that emphasis on religion, the feeling that this was wrong, that even if people had committed crimes, that they didn't deserve that. And there needed to be a system that would not only better treat people, but give people the opportunity to better themselves, give people the opportunity to change, to be rehabilitated so that they could lead better lives. And there again, is the emphasis of the Second Great Awakening. If you recall, this message on redemption, this emphasis that anybody could be saved, that even a criminal should have the opportunity to reform themselves and rejoin society as a better person. So due to the efforts of Dorothea Dix, we start to see a lot of states improving their prison systems, establishing separate prisons for juvenile offenders, separate facilities for people that were mentally ill, having, separate cells for people, and kind of separating different kinds of criminals, not housing people that were there for nonviolent crimes from people that were being imprisoned for violent crimes. And also the whole idea of prison being a place of reform, not just punishment, that prison should be a place where people could be rehabilitated. There's this emphasis on rehabilitation, that people should be provided with opportunity, particularly young offenders and particularly people that had not committed violent crimes, that they should have the opportunity to learn something while they were in prison, to learn a trade, to learn a skill, to learn to read, those sorts of things. We also see states starting to open separate mental hospitals to care for people that were mentally ill. Now, the caveat with that, of course, that we shouldn't fail to recognize is in this day, they still knew absolutely nothing about mental illness. And so they're really, as far as more accurate medical diagnoses for people that were schizophrenic versus people that were intellectually disabled versus people that, whatever, it all just kind of got grouped together. And these mental institutions could be horrible places by our standards, absolutely horrible. With terrible treatment and that sort of thing. However, at the time, that was a difference. It was a reform to say this is an illness versus a crime, and people needed to be cared for rather than punished. So yes, there are limits to it, and yes, by our standards, it is pretty barbaric, but it was a change in a different direction that was probably a good one in the grand scheme of things. And again, emphasizing this theme of redemption and helping and being a voice for those that maybe could not have a voice themselves. Another big aspect all of this is education reform, which doesn't have as much of a religious emphasis on it, but is related to some of the other things that we've talked about previously. What we're going to see is the movement towards public education. And the person that is largely responsible for this in many ways is Horace Mann. Horace Mann is oftentimes considered or called the father of the public education movement. And what we mean, of course, by public education is education that was available to the masses, education that was available to everyone, and that was paid for by, states and local governments. So education being available to the average person as opposed to just being available to those who could pay for a private education and private tutors. Horace Mann was adamant, and he was from Massachusetts, and he kind of led the charge in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts kind of became the model state for other states to base their public education systems on. And Horace Mann, like a lot of other education reformers at the time, began to believe that education was essential, that as times were changing and the country was changing, education was no longer a luxury. That wasn't just a luxury that only certain people needed. That was a necessity that everybody needed, that the common man ought to be able to have. So make this connection here between this and Jacksonian democracy. Part of this has to do with the other changes in Jacksonian democracy, mainly voting rights. If you recall, more people are able to vote in this period. They're dropping property requirements for voting. And so the wisdom became that, even the average person needs to be able to read and write. If they're going to be voters, they need to be able to read. They need to be able to write. They need to have basic education. And so the notion, the wisdom, the consensus becomes that education is important for anyone. It is a part of a democratic society. It is part of having a healthy democratic society is you want to have an educated population. People need to know how to read and to write. So it becomes, the perception that this is necessary for everyone, not just people that are going to go on to college, not just people that are going to go on to be lawyers and doctors, but just the average guy needs to have this as well. It also has to do with industrialization. As the country was industrializing, employers, wanted a workforce that had basic literacy skills, that was somewhat educated so they could be more productive and better employees. So Horace Mann encourages states, starting with Massachusetts, to fund public schools, to establish public schools, and to put money into that and really invest in public education for the masses. Other innovations, like having schools divided by grade, having standards in grades where there are certain things that children should be learning in each grade and certain things they ought to be able to do before going on to the next grade. Having a standardized education where students in this town and that town and all over the country are learning similar things and being held to the same standards. Education reform also includes textbook adoption, adopting writing and then adopting textbooks that were designed to teach young children, to teach reading skills, not just a book to read, but books that taught you how to read and how to do math and all those kind of things. And also seeing education as a means of not just teaching people to read and to write, but to teach democratic values, to teach people the value of hard work, to teach people the value of thriftiness, to teach people the value and the importance of being your own person, of being reliable, confidence, all those kinds of things. So what we would call character education, seeing that as important for a democratic society as well. Another aspect of education reform is teacher training, to see teaching as a true profession and something that people required specific training for. And so it also included the establishment of what were called normal schools. And normal schools were simply schools to train teachers where people would go to learn to be teachers. Before this, teachers were people that had education, but maybe they studied, sciences or liberal arts or whatever, and they just kind of fell back on teaching. But teaching itself, as far as pedagogy and methods, and seeing that as like a true profession, like the way that a doctor or a lawyer would be seen as a true profession, that was kind of the new thing. So normal schools to train teachers, and there are a lot of colleges and universities today that actually got their start as normal schools. So teacher training is a part of it as well. I mentioned textbook adoption being a part of this also, that we see a lot of textbook writers out there publishing textbooks that were designed, again, not just to teach children to read and to write and to do arithmetic, but also to teach values and skills and all those sorts of things as well. One such textbook writer, you'll probably recognize this name, is Noah Webster. You probably know Noah Webster best for Webster's Dictionary. He was the author of that dictionary. And that's part of education reform too, to kind of standardize American English, to emphasize, and kind of standardize spellings of words and usage of words and meanings of words, because that could vary from place to place, as you probably know. But Noah Webster also wrote other textbooks as well, and those kind of things are being adopted all over the country. Now, as you can probably imagine, this is not as prevalent in some parts of the country as others. It is certainly in the North where we're going to see this happening more. The North and the West are going to be far more committed to public education and prison reform and mental illness reform, mental institution reform, and things like that than, say, the South. The South is always going to lag behind in this area. One, because the South is so rural, the South doesn't want to pay for a lot of this stuff, and of course the issue of race, the South not wanting to educate African Americans and certainly not slaves, but even poor white people as well. But all of this, while it may not always have a religious tone to it, there is this emphasis on making the country more democratic, giving everybody the access to education and teaching democratic values to make the country function better and have a more productive, more valuable democratic society.